Hey, everyone! I just want to take a moment to thank you all for your amazing support on this channel. Your time, your views, your likes, comments, and especially your subscriptions mean the world to me. I truly appreciate each and every one of you for being part of this journey. Now, let's dive into today's video. North Korea, China, Russia. These are some of the most infamous dictatorships around the world, known for having totalitarian regimes that have been in place for decades. The Kim dynasty has ruled North Korea since 1948, launching their regime only 3 years after Japan lost control over the region. Kim Jong-un became the supreme leader of North Korea in 2011 and has remained in power since then. Xi Jinping, the president of the People's Republic of China, rose to power in 2013 and represents the head of the Chinese Communist Party, the only party that has existed in China since 1949. Russian President Vladimir Putin has also maintained power for decades, first rising to the position of president in 2000. Yet much like democratic countries, these nations ironically still hold regular elections for the public to elect leaders and officials, though the form these elections take looks different from country to country. But why would an authoritarian regime allow their citizens to vote in an election? And what's the purpose of it if the outcome is already decided before the people even cast their ballots? Well, to understand why elections are still held in countries run by dictators, we first have to look at how elections unfold in these countries and why it seems the dictator already in power, no matter how brutal, always comes out on top against their competitors. Let's take a look at North Korea. As in the United States, elections for local officials come around every 4 years. But the election in North Korea looks very different from what democratic countries have. During the elections, citizens who are 17 or older line up at voting centers and wait in long lines to cast their ballots. Only the ballot is just a piece of paper with one name on it. Voters can either place it in the ballot box right away, signifying a yes vote for the candidate, or they can cross out the name, which would indicate opposition to the chosen candidate. But voting no for the candidate put forward by the regime is almost unheard of because in a country like North Korea, voting against the regime is dangerous. An action like this could lead to being tracked down by the secret police or even being declared insane. Just entering a voting booth to cast your vote in private can raise suspicion. Once you finish up voting, you're welcome to join the cheering crowds outside. Excited that you've been able to cast your vote to support the glorious leadership of the country, you might be wondering. If the election in North Korea is so clearly just for show, why do the people of the country bother to even show up? Just to encounter long lines and a lack of freedom? Well, in North Korea, not voting isn't an option. In fact, the nation has one of the highest voter turnouts in the world at almost 100%. But that's because if you don't vote, you could end up under suspicion of the regime. Similar to North Korea, China holds elections, but in a highly limited capacity. In China, deciding who will become the president of the country doesn't lie in the hands of the people by way of popular vote. Rather, the president is elected by fellow members of the government in China's version of Congress. Truthfully, members of the Chinese Communist Party are the ones who put forth a candidate to become the president. This candidate is then voted in with no opposition put forth. Although people don't directly vote for the president, China does allow its people to vote for local officials in direct elections at the town or village level. But even for these local roles, the candidates go through a stringent nomination process, and the Chinese Communist Party has a lot of authority to monitor who can appear on the ballot. And after the local elections take place, the question becomes how much power do these so-called elected officials actually have? The answer is that usually they have little actual power. Instead, the true local power lies with the regional Chinese Communist Party officials. This makes the elections practically inconsequential, at least from the perspective of giving the Chinese people a voice in their government. Like North Korea and China, Russia's elections are heavily fixed as well. But the country does so in a way that tries to actually make it seem like they're real, even though everyone still knows they're not. Presidential elections come about every 6 years in Russia, and presidents are elected through a 2-round popular vote in the first round. All candidates compete for votes. If one wins a majority over half the votes, the election is over and that candidate wins. But if no one has a complete majority, the top two candidates run against each other in the second round of elections to determine who wins the majority. The actual election process is very similar to a democratic nation like France's process, with electronic voting counting systems, multiple candidates representing different parties on the ballot, and multiple rounds. In Russia, the candidates are allowed to campaign freely in the months leading up to the election, or at least under the illusion of freedom. It may sound legit on the surface, except none of the candidates running against Putin actually have a chance of winning because none of them are actual threats, and Putin makes sure of that. The actual candidates who could win are of course banned from running. There's no greater example of this than Alexei Navalny, arguably Putin's biggest rival to date. He, of course, was barred from running in the 2018 presidential election due to this reason. But not only that, he was poisoned by a Russian nerve agent in 2020 and barely survived after being treated in Germany. Upon his brave return to Russia, he was arrested and sentenced to 19 years in prison. He finally met his fate just weeks before the 2024 election, where he died of so-called natural causes while in a maximum security corrective colony all the way in the unforgiving Arctic Circle just weeks before the election. This, of course, is just the key footnotes of his life, as he's also been arrested countless times on fabricated charges, had countless friends living in exile or assassinated, and of course, his political party, Russia of the Future, has repeatedly been declined official registration by the Russian government. You don't even have to be a true threat to be barred from running. Just being someone with an opposing viewpoint can do it. Boris Nadezhdin, a former member of the State Duma, was the only explicitly anti-war candidate in the 2024 elections, and although he passed the initial stages of the election process, was also eventually disqualified from running. Now, of course, he probably would never have won the election, and to be honest, Navalny probably wouldn't have won in 2018 either. But that's not really the point. If you pose a threat in even the slightest way, you are banned from running, while at the same time the Kremlin's control of basically all the media means media coverage is largely focused only on Putin and in a positive light, while everyone else basically gets nothing, if not relentless attacks instead. The only way around this is through the use of a VPN, which is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. This way, the Russian government wouldn't be able to see what type of journalism you're looking at. If you're a journalist criticizing Putin, you'll just be assassinated like Anna Politkovskaya was. And if you're a critic, even if you're powerful, you'll have the same fate, such as former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia Boris Nemtsov. The stifling of threats built up over time, along with complete media and voting control, is why Putin has been leader of Russia for over 2 decades now, as well as being elected to his 5th term in office in 2024 with 88% of the popular vote. There are other smaller nations that share commonalities with these dictatorships. One of these countries is Belarus, which shares a border with Russia and is a close ally of the larger authoritarian country. Its leader, President Alexander Lukashenko, has been in power literally ever since Belarus became independent. So for 30 years now, over 65-year presidential terms. It's for these reasons that he's been referred to as Europe's last dictator. He employs many of the same tactics as his close ally Putin by only allowing for candidates loyal to him and his policies to compete in lower-level elections while he denies being a dictator. In the last presidential election in 2020, the initial main rival planning to run against him, YouTuber Sergei Tikhanovsky, was arrested 2 days after announcing he was going to run and sentenced to 18 years in prison. His wife, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who ran in his place, was forced into exile in Lithuania after the elections too. All opposition candidates have filed appeals to the Central Election Commission calling for the results to be invalidated, and the European Union doesn't even recognize the results of the elections either. These types of systems are common all over the world in authoritarian regimes, from Cuba to Venezuela to Syria. They mostly follow one of the systems that North Korea, Russia, or China has. And after every election, especially in places like Russia, Belarus, and Venezuela, there's mass protests with hundreds of thousands of people after the rigged elections or opposition murdered, and then the ensuing sanctions and condemnation from the Western world. But now you may be wondering, if dictators have to go through all this trouble to rig elections, why even have them in the first place? Why not be like Eritrea's dictator, Isaias Afewerki, who's literally not held an election since his country's independence in 1993, over 30 years ago when he assumed power? What benefits are they receiving from these sham elections that make them worthwhile? Well, there's several reasons dictatorships perpetuate the image of a free election. The first and most basic reason comes from history. Elections have not always been as common as they are now. We might take them for granted, but during the period of the Cold War, most authoritarian regimes didn't hold elections. Because what was the point, right? The government and their citizens and the rest of the world knew who would win. So why waste the energy? Well, that changed after the Cold War, which propelled the United States to the top of the international food chain with its allies in tow. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States was the major superpower left standing in the spotlight on the international stage. But this didn't just mean victory for the United States. It meant victory for democracy as a whole. And elections are an integral part of the democratic system, the main mode that allows the people to have a say in the government at the time. Most countries, even totalitarian regimes with much different ideals, weren't interested in opposing the very powerful US or its democratic principles. As a result, elections, even if they were a sham, became an international standard. Countries, even dictatorships, began to hold elections every several years as a show that they did employ democratic ideals, regardless of how democratic the election process actually was. It's all about the optics. Since elections under dictatorships masquerade as civic freedoms for their people, elections can also make totalitarian governments seem more amicable to their people and reduce the cruel reputation dictators might develop, especially in a world moving towards advocacy for human rights. Elections, regardless of whether they're real or not, help dictators jump on the bandwagon and show that they care about their people's rights, too. It looks much worse if a government strips the right to vote away from its citizens than if it allows its people to go through the motions of a sham election. Key to this, too, is that if it does seem like the dictator is, well, being a dictator, then they lose access to a wide range of international forums that they find attractive to participate in. Not only because it gives them more wealth and a seat at important tables, but it also gives them international legitimacy and recognition, something which the international community often ignores when there's no elections at all. So, as a result, you can see in this graph the jump in national elections each year around the world. In 1946, the elections per year was around 30, and this steadily increased over the decades. By 2012, there were 80 per year. No country wants to look like a nation that doesn't give its people a voice on the international stage, so elections became an institutional habit around the globe. Elections also provide other long-term benefits for dictators if they play their cards right. Ironically, they can actually lead to a stronger and more stable regime over time, because elections serve as major propaganda tactics for totalitarian leaders. Take North Korea, for example. Elections there are viewed as a mandatory part of life that unifies the country and is supposed to drum up morale among the people for their leader. In North Korea, Election Day is treated as a national holiday of sorts. Masses of people cheer on their government after they cast their vote in support of the continuation of the Kim dynasty and its chosen officials. It's a major event in the country that displays unity and loyalty of the people behind a single leader. Regardless of the lack of freedom in the North Korean election, this scene of joyful citizens paints a picture of strength for the Kim regime and stability for the nation as a whole. In Russia, the election can serve as a strengthening tool as well. When the election is a landslide victory for the incumbent, of course it serves as another piece of propaganda for the government. State-controlled media outlets are able to advertise that the president received a huge percentage of votes. But there's another dimension to elections that make them even more appealing to dictators. Elections provide a unique opportunity for the government to analyze their country and sniff out competition within it. Elections that seem to allow for a potential shift in command bring the opposition and critics out of the woodwork as they become more vocal with their opinions in hopes of inspiring change. This means that the government can silence opposition and political figures who could pose a threat to the regime's continuation in the future. Meanwhile, elections can be used to indicate where exactly the leader is slipping in popular support, and subsequently where to target more propaganda. It also shows them how stable their regime actually is, because if they're genuinely uncontested, then they're probably good for a while. Then there's the intimidation via an overwhelming victory on election day, yet another tool to stifle the opposition. If the votes are counted and the incumbent has won yet again, it's bound to intimidate critics and opponents and make them think twice about speaking out against the regime. After all, if a dictator can't even be called out on winning a fake election, then there's no point to even bother opposing them. Because of the propaganda power of these elections, they can actually prolong the rule of the totalitarian regime, all while operating under the guise of allowing people to make the choices in their country. On the flip side, of course, elections can pose major issues for totalitarian regimes because they bring the risk of heightened opposition to the dictatorship around election time. Elections tend to encourage more political involvement and a potential desire for change, so these periods can actually become the most fragile periods for dictatorships. Just like how elections bring the critics out in full force, it also gives them an almost power-like boost as people get excited about the politics. So it makes these people even more likely to put their ideas into practice and take action against the regime. In fact, statistical models indicate that the risk of a regime falling is about 5 times higher during an election year than during an ordinary year. Coups and intense protests become much more likely, placing the regime in a delicate state on and around election day. Based on historical occurrences, the concern for dictators is a valid one. When people are given the pretense of free choice, sometimes they insist on taking it. This actually happened in South Korea during the dictatorship of Syngman Rhee. He ran uncontested in 1960 due to his opponent dying of cancer right before the elections, so he obviously won with 100% of the vote. Because of this, popular focus was shifted to the vice presidential election, where his candidate Lee Ki-pung competed against strongmen. The elections were, of course, heavily rigged in Lee's favor, and widespread allegations of corruption and manipulation of the results sparked protests, which spiraled into the April Revolution, in which police killed 186 people, most notably students, during its 2 weeks. The resulting scandal caused Rhee to resign just a month after the election, ushering in the Second Republic of Korea. The same thing happened in the Philippines in 1986, when the government held a national election. When the election results were announced that incumbent President Ferdinand Marcos had allegedly won according to the official count, though by a slim majority, the people of the Philippines refused to accept the supposed victory and were outraged by the results. The people didn't simply accept the results and move on with their lives. They demanded change. The citizens of the country, as well as people around the world, protested the results, claiming that the opponent, Corazon Aquino, actually won the election and that the government had rigged it. The weeks that followed were chaotic across the country as mass demonstrations took place. Finally, as Aquino's supporters overran parts of Manila and seized state media, Marcos was forced to flee. Of course, these things don't always work out, as we saw with Belarus's election in 2020, as Lukashenko successfully clung to power despite widespread opposition, thanks to Russia's financial and political support for him. But the point is that it can. This potential for mass protests, overthrow, and the lack of stability isn't the only downside of holding an election, though. There are simple logistic barriers, too, that might deter a government from holding an election, especially one that will have no impact whatsoever on who is chosen for governmental positions. Elections are a lot of work to put together for a government. They require national coordination efforts, extensive work by government employees, and marketing efforts to push people to vote. Not only is this a lot of effort to go through, and yet another thing for the government to have to worry about among the many issues national leaders encounter daily, but it's also very expensive. In the United States, running a full-scale democratic presidential election costs a massive $2 to $3 billion. And that's not even counting the cost incurred by presidential candidates to run their campaigns and efforts by non-governmental organizations to encourage people to cast their vote. So it isn't easy. It requires a lot of planning, a lot of coordination, and a lot of cash. So ultimately, with the proven risk of regime breakdown and the expense that falls on the government to actually carry out an election event, why do dictators continue to hold regular elections? Well, there's something innately powerful about having the right to vote, obviously, and it has the potential to put down or jumpstart unrest among the nation's citizens. And it seems that for most dictators, the long-term pros of an election outweigh the cons of destabilization. The threat against regimes during election years is a short-term concern that is worth the risk to gain the propaganda benefits of holding an election and to display strength. For dictators, image is crucial, both internally and on the international stage. They must appear strong and stable. Elections help them do this, making it worth the danger of sparking their very undoing. Thank you for watching.